The New York Rangers are back in the playoffs and ready to face one of their top rivals, the New Jersey Devils. John Chik of Locked On New York Rangers joins us to discuss that and all things Rangers as we head into the Stanley Cup playoffs. And welcome back, everybody. Gil Martin here. The Locked On road to the Stanley Cup playoffs continues as we welcome John Chik of Locked On New York Rangers to take stock of the Rangers' chances to make a deep playoff run. And John, what would you say is the biggest story for the Rangers heading into the postseason this year?
Yeah, I think there's two players that are going to be under the microscope as far as Ranger fans concerned, and really just general hockey fans, anybody that just happens to be tuning into this series. I think you start with Artemi Panarin. He was a little bit shaky in the playoffs last year, and it's funny. I've talked about this on my show. Artemi Panarin, in what was considered, kind of a down run for him in the Stanley Cup playoffs last year, still ends up with 16 points in 20 games and still ends up with a Game 7 overtime winner against a team that I consider to be the Rangers' biggest rivals, and that's the Pittsburgh Penguins. But he was a little bit shaky last year, a little bit indecisive at times, turned the puck over a little bit too often, just didn't seem like the bread man. And one thing that I think bodes well for him going into the playoffs this year is the Rangers recently, a game against the Lightning, a game against the Canes, two games that were played at kind of like playoff level intensity, and he was very, very good in that environment. So, there's no substitute for the real thing, the actual Stanley Cup playoffs, but I think that bodes well for Panarin's chances of having a better run in the playoffs this year, and obviously the Rangers are going to need that. And the other player is Patrick Kane. He came over with all this hype and fanfare and, put up decent stats, but something just seems to be missing right now. We're not getting the three-time Cup champion. We're not getting Showtime Patrick Kane. We're getting a guy who's there, and he's done all right, but I think Ranger fans are looking for him to take it to that next level too. So I think those two players in particular certainly going to be, like I said, under the microscope for Ranger fans and just general hockey fans.
Well, hopefully from a Ranger perspective, the playoffs will help him click into that next gear. Tell me a little bit about the biggest reason why your team will win the Stanley Cup.
I think you got to start with Igor Shesterkin. He hasn't had as good of a season as he did last year, but I've said on my show, I'll never hold him to that standard like year in and year out. He has to put up these video game-like numbers that we saw him put up last year. That was really a season for the ages, and, obviously he won the Vezina. I don't even think there was really a debate last year. This year, a couple more ups and downs, which is kind of reflective of how the team was. They've had their ups and downs this season too, maybe a little bit more so than last year. But the thing that's really encouraging about Igor for me is that he's played his best hockey down the stretch here. If you look at his last 10 games, he has allowed 2 goals or fewer in 8 of them. He has not allowed more than 3 goals in any of those games, and he's got 2 shutouts mixed in there too. And just, forget about the stats. Just looking at the eye test, he looks like Igor Shesterkin. He looks like he's playing with a bunch of confidence. Looks like the guy that won the Vezina last year. So I think, goalies for me are still huge in the Stanley Cup playoffs. We've seen some not so great teams go on long runs because of their goalie in large part. And we've seen some really good teams falter because their goalie can't make a save. So for me, he's still the ultimate X factor. And I'm excited about where Igor Shesterkin is, and I'm looking forward to what he can do in the playoffs.
How about the biggest reason why the Rangers would not win the Stanley Cup?
I would say it's mainly just because when you look at the Eastern Conference right now, the field is just absolutely loaded, and you can start with the team that they're playing right now, the New Jersey Devils. It's funny, Gil, we were actually talking for a second right before we hit record here. The Devils right now, they're kind of the Rangers of last year, where you've got this team that's way ahead of schedule on the rebuild, and a team that, for some reason or another, it feels like maybe isn't getting the respect it deserves, isn't being taken as seriously as they should be. I really felt that way about the Rangers last year. I think now people take them seriously. But yeah, man, the Devils have put it all back together. The rebuild, it seems to be ahead of schedule. And they beat the Rangers 3 out of 4 games this year. So, the Rangers are going to have to bring it. The Devils have a very high compete level. I do think the Rangers will ultimately win the series, but not before, every fan of both teams completely loses their mind, because I think it's going to be a long series, and I'm sure we'll get an overtime game or 2 mixed in there as well. But yeah, and if you get by the Devils, then you've got, the Canes, and then you've got either the Bruins or maybe the Lightning or the Leafs waiting for you. So, it's a loaded field this year, and I think that's going to be the biggest reason. If the Rangers don't make it all the way, it's going to be because one of these other juggernauts, just beats them.
You've mentioned a few already, but who do you feel is a key player to watch on the Rangers?
Yeah, I kind of want to go with a little bit of an under-the-radar player because, it's easy to talk about Panarin and Mika Zibanejad and Kreider, all the guys that you expect. I'm going to say Filip Chytil. The kid line has played very well down the stretch this year, And Philip Hedl has had something of a breakout season, hit the 20-goal plateau for the first time, got the in-season extension from Chris Drury, where he's going to be here for another 4 years. I think it's a really reasonable price. And, in some situations in the playoffs, I think, a top line against a top line, they might kind of cancel each other out a little bit, where it's a little bit of a stalemate, a little bit of a draw, and both lines do equal damage. But that kid line, man, if that kid line can get going and, outperform the Devils' third line, and if the Rangers are fortunate enough to get by the Devils, outperform other third lines, I've been saying this, that is when this Ranger team really becomes dangerous, when that kid line is really clicking. And I think it's going to be Philip Hedl leading the way. He had a great run in the playoffs last year, and I'm looking for more of the same this year.
And what would a successful playoff run look like for the Rangers, and what's at stake if they fall short?
Successful playoff run results in these guys lifting the Stanley Cup over their head when it's all said and done. And obviously we're getting way ahead of ourselves. I mean, it's such a marathon, and I'll always say this. I think this is the hardest championship in sports to win. You can have the more talented team, but that doesn't mean as much in hockey playoffs, I think, as it does in some other sports playoffs. You look at the NBA, and nothing against basketball or anything, but the 1 seed is not going to lose to the 8 seed. It just doesn't happen in that sport. In this sport, we see upsets all the time, and Columbus over Tampa Bay a few years ago, I think, is a great example of that. So, obviously it's going to be tough for the Rangers, but yeah, I mean, I think the Rangers, I don't know if they're the top dog as far as who the favorite is around the NHL right now, but they got to be like in the top 5 area. And, if things come together and they play well and they execute, it's possible that we could finally see another Stanley Cup for the New York Rangers. And it would only be their second in 83 years or whatever it is at this point. So it would be quite the moment for Ranger fans. And what was the second part of your question, Gil?
What's at stake if they don't?
Oh, right. So, I mean, there's definitely there's going to be some changes this offseason because you bring in a lot of players at the trade deadline. Every player the Rangers brought in at the deadline is an impending UFA. Tarasenko, Kane, Mikkola, Mott. Very good chance. I mean, there's no way that all 4 of them are going to be back. And honestly, I think it's conceivable that none of them are back. It might just be a situation where, the Rangers are kind of priced out of it because the Rangers, you see how tight they are against the cap now. I think they're like about $1,000 below it. And they got some tough decisions to make this offseason. Lafreniere is an impending RFA. Same thing for K'Andre Miller. I mentioned that Philip Hedl got the extension. So can you do some salary cap gymnastics? Can you trade somebody away and maybe make some room for Vladimir Tarasenko to stick around? It's possible, but that's going to be tough, man, especially with a lot of the young players that the Rangers have who, whether it's this offseason or the one after that, these guys are going to have to get paid at a certain time. So the Ranger team that starts next season could end up looking quite a bit different than the Ranger team that ends this season. And that's true whether they win the Cup or don't win the Cup.
Yeah, it should be very interesting on Broadway. John, thank you so much. That does it for our New York Rangers preview here on the Locked On Road to the Stanley Cup. Be sure to subscribe or follow Locked On New York Rangers for free on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. The Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.